welcome to Crimes Through Time, a weekly snapshot of crime history. The Ratcliff Highway got its name from the red cliffs that descend from the plateau on which the road was situated. But in the 19th century it was more of a district than a road, one with a long history of vice and violence. Long before 1888, when Mary Kelly would make her home there after fleeing France before her fateful move to Whitechapel, 2 attacks occurred in December 1811 on 2 families located just half a mile apart. In total, 7 people would lose their lives. John Williams would be accused of the crimes, based on very dubious circumstantial evidence, yet he would never stand trial, taking his own life. The court decided that this was a clear sign of his guilt and convicted him in his absence. Let's explore the murders of the Marr and Williamson families, what would become known as the Ratcliff Highway Murders. The first attack occurred on the 7th of December 1811. Timothy Marr, his wife Celia, and 14-week-old son Timothy lived above their linen drapers and hosiery shop at 29 Ratcliff Highway. They shared their home with James Gowan, an apprentice, and Margaret Jewell, their servant. It was just before midnight. The 7th was a Saturday, which was payday for most working class, and the couple, anticipating a busy day, were preparing the shop for business. Margaret was out, having been sent to purchase oysters for a late-night supper, and to go to a local bakery in John Hill to pay a bill. She would report that as she opened the shop door to leave, she saw a figure of a man across the road framed in light. Even at this late hour, the whole area was usually busy with people, so in the moment she thought nothing of it, and continued on her errand. First stop was the oyster shop, which was closed. She then walked back past the Marrs on the way to the bakery. Through the window she could see her boss working. Unfortunately, that too was closed, as was another oyster shop she tried, so she returned home empty-handed. It was 20 past midnight when she arrived back home, to find the shop in darkness and the door locked. Assuming at first they had forgotten that she was out, she knocked harder. She heard what she thought were footsteps on the stairs and a baby crying out. She thought that they were coming to let her in, until she heard footsteps behind her. Frightened, she began to bang the knocker against the door, quote, with unmitigating violence, drawing the attention of the night watchman, George Olney. George knew the family well, and he called out and knocked without success. Then he noticed that the shutters were in place, but weren't latched. The commotion that Margaret and George were making finally woke the next-door neighbour, John Murray. John jumped the dividing wall in his yard. He found the back door to 29 Ratcliff Highway open and a light on inside. He entered first, going upstairs, calling to Timothy and Celia. He was met with silence. He returned to the ground floor and entered the shop, where he observed, quote, the carnage of the night stretched out on the floor. The narrow premises so floated with gore that it was hardly possible to escape the pollution of blood in picking out a path to the front door. He first found James Gowan, the apprentice. He lay just inside the shop door. He had suffered a head injury so violent that brain matter was present on the wall and across the counter. In shock, John headed straight to the front door to let in George. There he found the body of Celia Marr, also severely beaten about the head. Together the men looked for Timothy Marr. He would be found behind the counter, also battered to death. Horror then gripped the men as they raced to the living quarters above the shop, and to baby Timothy Marr, who was found in his crib, also the victim of extreme violence. By now a crowd had formed outside the shop, and the Thames River Police had been summoned. The Metropolitan Police had yet to be created. Police officer Charles Horton was first on the scene. The crimes were violent and apparently without motive. £152 were found in a bedroom drawer, and the float was still in the till. The murder weapon was found in the bedroom, a heavy, long-handled shipwright's hammer, or maul. It was covered in blood and matter from the victims. 2 sets of footprints were discovered at the back of the shop. They contained blood and sawdust from the carpentry work that had occurred in the shop earlier that day. A group followed the tracks to Pennington Street, which ran behind the house. They encountered a man who would report seeing a group of 10 men running away in the direction of New Gravel Lane, shortly after George raised the alarm. Could this be the work of a criminal gang? Several men were arrested after being identified as being in the area of the crime, including 3 sailors, but all of them had a solid explanation for their presence. A reward of 50 guineas was offered and a handbill was printed. Unfortunately, it misidentified one of the victims as James Biggs rather than Gowan. A coroner's jury was convened on the 10th of December. Given the tight window in which the crimes were committed, it was concluded that the perpetrator was watching the shop. Margaret left at 11:55 p.m. and returned at 12:20 a.m. John Murray testified that he heard bangs at about 12:10 a.m. The killer was most likely still in the shop when Margaret returned and fled out the back door. Suspicion fell on everyone and anyone close to the family. Cornelius Hart, one of the carpenters in the shop that day, was detained. Timothy Marr's brother was interrogated for 48 hours, as there had been a rumour that he had had a falling out with his brother, but he was found to have a solid alibi. A servant girl that had been let go by the family was questioned, but she had the lack of physical strength to carry out the murders alone and had no links to the criminal types that would carry out the crime on her behalf. All 4 victims shared a memorial service on the 15th of December 1811. They were buried beneath a monument in the parish church of St George in the East. On Thursday the 19th of December, the moor was finally cleaned and it appeared that initials had been carved into the handle by a seaman's copping punch, either IP or JP. The police set about identifying the owner, but unbeknownst to them, the case was going to take a violent turn later that very night, when just 12 days after the killing of the Marr family, another family were attacked. This time it was the Williamson family, who lived at the King's Arms, a tavern at 81 New Gravel Lane, a business that they had run for the past 15 years. Earlier that evening, John Williamson, a 56-year-old publican, had asked the parish constables to keep an eye on a man wearing a brown jacket, lurking in the tavern and listening at his door. He requested that he be arrested on sight. Not long after this, the constables were confused to see a nearly naked man lowering himself down from the upper story of the pub, using a rope of knotted sheets. A crowd were forming around the hysterical man as he cried out, "Murder!" As he dropped to the street, he became inconsolable. The man was John Turner, a lodger who had been staying at the pub for 8 months. The crowd forced open the tavern doors and discovered John's body lying face up on the steps leading to the tap room. He had been severely beaten and his throat cut. Next to him was an iron crowbar. This appeared to be the weapon used to beat him, but a sharper instrument had been used on his throat and to almost hack off his hand. John's wife, 60-year-old Elizabeth, and their servant, Bridget Anna Harrington, who was in her late 50s, were also brutally killed. They were discovered in the parlour. They both had suffered head injuries and had their throats cut. Bridget's feet were beneath the grate, as if she had been struck while preparing the fire for the next morning. Miraculously, 14-year-old Catherine Stilwell, the Williamsons' granddaughter, was found sleeping safe and well in an upstairs bedroom. Given what had happened at the Marr shop, it is amazing that she was alive and had actually slept through the attack that had taken place just below her on the ground floor. London Bridge was sealed off and fire bells were rung to gather volunteers to search. An eyewitness reported seeing a man wear a flushing coat, which was a loose-fitting, hooded coat, and several Bow Street runners were assigned to hunt the murderer. Bow Street runners were law enforcement officers that worked for Bow Street magistrates in the city of Westminster. They are London's first professional police force. Starting out with only 6 men in 1749, the Metropolitan Police Detective Agency traces their origins back to them. The perpetrator had gained entrance by forcing the cellar flap. They had exited through an open window, leaving blood on the windowsill and a footprint in the mud. The escape route meant that they ran along a clay-covered slope, covering them in clay and making them easily identifiable. But the killer was long gone from the scene. There was no known links between the families and no obvious motives. This time John's watch had been taken and it was clear that both crimes had been interrupted. Could this simply be robberies? Seems unlikely to me though. Child murder is so extreme and was unnecessary to carry out a robbery. Violence of this kind tends to have a personal motive, for example to satisfy the desires of the perpetrator or for revenge on the victim. Let me know what you think in the comments. A sort of task force was formed, comprised of constables from various parishes and the Bow Street runners. Local magistrates convened and doubled the reward to 100 guineas, plus neighbouring parishes offered additional rewards. The public began to panic. The newspapers covered the attacks for weeks on end, turning the killings into the first national crime sensation. The authorities were pressured into action. The Home Secretary, Richard Ryder, appointed Aaron Graham, the Bow Street magistrate, to open an inquiry, and the coroner's inquest convened at the Black Horse, a tavern opposite the Williamsons' King's Arms. Finally, survivor John Turner gave his account of the night of the murders. He arrived home to the tavern at 10:40 p.m. and retired to his room on the upper floor. He heard the front door bang open and Bridget shouted, quote, "We are all murdered." John Williamson exclaims, quote, "I am a dead man." John Turner recounted the sound of several blows and someone walking around. So quietly he speculated that their shoes mustn't have had nails. He waited for it all to go silent and then crept down the stairs. The door stood open, with a light shining from inside the room. As he approached, he saw the intruder. He stood 6 foot tall, wearing a flushing coat. He was bent over Elizabeth, rummaging through her pockets. In that moment, he decided he could do nothing for the Williamsons, and quickly returned upstairs so that he too wouldn't become a victim, making a sheet rope and escaping out of the window. John Turner was able to describe Mr. Williamson's missing watch and testified that the killer must have brought the crowbar with him as it was not from the tavern. All the witnesses from that night, along with the attending surgeon, gave evidence. Unsurprisingly, the jury returned a verdict of wilful murder by person or persons unknown. The task force decided on a prime suspect, John Williams, also known as Murphy. He was 27-year-old seaman lodging at the Pear Tree Public House on Cinnamon Street off Ratcliff Highway in Old Wapping. The Times described him as 5'9", slender, had a pleasing countenance and did not limp. His roommate noticed that he had returned to their room after midnight on the night the Williamsons were killed. John was an acquaintance of Timothy Marr, and there were rumours of a grievance stemming back from when they were shipmates. He had no connection to those in the King's Arms other than that he and a friend had shared a drink in there much earlier on that night. He was much shorter than John Turner's description of the killer. When he was arrested, he had 2 pawn tickets, some silver coins and a £1 note in his pockets. He never denied having been at the pub that night. His alibi for the rest of the evening was that he had consulted a surgeon regarding an old injury, along with a woman skilled in herbal medicine. He also pawned some items of clothes, which accounted for the money he had. He offered up the pawn tickets as proof. Unfortunately, no one followed up with either person or checked the dates on the pawn tickets. Despite protesting his innocence, he was remanded to Coldbath Fields Prison. On the 24th of December, police were able to identify who the maul found in the Marr's shop belonged to: John Peterson, who was away at sea and had been when the murders were carried out. The information was given by Mr. Vermillow, the landlord of the Pear Tree, following his incarceration for debt. Police searched the pub and found the trunk that once contained the maul. Mr. Vermillow confessed that he had taken the maul and chipped it, so he was sure that it was in the trunk. It is worth noting that the reward money for information in the case would have cleared his debts and released him from prison. Remember that the Pear Tree was searched at this point, because it will become important later on in the case. In an open forum magistrates hearing, John Turner was asked to identify John Williams as the murderer, but he couldn't, but did admit that he knew the man's face from him having been a regular visitor to the tavern. Strangely, given the lack of corroboration of actual leads such as the pawn shop, they asked John's laundress if she had washed any bloody clothes. She hadn't washed any of his clothes after the second attack, but she recalled blood on a collar and a ripped shirt. She had assumed that he had been in a fight. John tried to explain that yes, he had been in a brawl after a tense card game, but he was silenced by the magistrate and returned to prison. Here is a summary of the case against John Williams. He had an opportunity to access the mall. He returned to his room after the killer had fled the Williamson crime scene, the bloody torn shirt, and he had money. Tragically, the case wouldn't make it to trial, at least not with John present. John used his scarf to hang himself from an iron bar in his prison cell on the 28th of December 1811. It was a shock to those who had spoken with John the day before, including the warden. He was in good spirits, confident that he was innocent and would be proved to be so. There is a theory that John was murdered to prevent the authorities from looking elsewhere. The trial would continue without John to defend himself. Once he was dead, there certainly was a lot more fingers being pointed his way as people suddenly remembered more details. A secret prison correspondence had been discovered between John and another man, quote, which clearly connects them with the shocking transactions. A separate roommate testified that he had found his own stockings muddy and hidden in a chest. He concluded that John must have worn them, and when he confronted him, he immediately took them into the yard and began washing them. The landlady confirmed this, but not only were the stockings muddy, they were covered in blood. They hadn't come forward earlier, for fear that John would kill them. Another female witness testified that John was connected to the chisel found at the Marr crime scene, although the chisel played no part in the murders. The court declared John Williams guilty of the crimes and cited his suicide as a statement of guilt. He was deemed the sole perpetrator of both attacks, even though there were no links to John being near the Marr shop that night. The Home Secretary decided the best way to settle the matter was to parade John's body through the streets of Wapping and Shadwell, to show that although he had, quote, cheated the hangman, he was indeed dead and the threat to the community was over. On the 31st of December, John's body was removed from prison at 11 a.m. Over 180,000 took part in the procession up the Ratcliff Highway. The event was described by Thomas de Quincey as, quote, when the cart came opposite the late Mr. Marr's house, a halt was made for nearly a quarter of an hour. The procession then advanced to St. George's Turnpike, where the new road, now Commercial Road, is intersected by Cannon Street Road. Those who accompanied the procession arrived at a grave already dug 6 feet down. The remains of John Williams was tumbled out of the cart and lowered into the hole, and then someone hammered a stake into his heart. The procession also stopped at the King's Arms, where the coachman whipped the dead man 3 times across the face. The stake would prevent the restless soul from wandering, as victims of suicide could not be buried in consecrated ground. The crossroads would confuse any evil spirits that rose from his grave. He was also buried upside down in a grave too small to ensure that in death he would be uncomfortable for eternity. By January 1812, the authorities still felt that they had to prove that John was the murderer. It was then that a jacket with a bloodied pocket, blood-stained trousers, and a bloody knife were found in the privy, the outside toilet, of the Pear Tree pub. None of these items, hidden in one of the most used areas of the pub, were found during the original search carried out by the police. Again, none of the items could be tied exclusively to John Williams and didn't do much but make the case look more curated than before. So what really happened? Of course we will never know for sure, but I will present what I think is the most likely scenario. Timothy Marr was in debt and was likely expecting guests that night, sending his servant Margaret on a fool's errand. After all, what shops are likely open for business at midnight? Inadvertently saving the woman's life. He would then negotiate in privacy, probably with a loan shark or protection racket. The chisel that the carpenter reported as missing in the day, but present at the crime scene, taken by Timothy to defend himself, but he didn't get the chance. Often those carrying out this kind of business have enforcers that are capable of vicious violence to scare and intimidate. When talks go sour, Timothy is killed, and then all in the household to remove any witnesses. The Williamson killings were damage limitation to cover links to the Marrs. The landlady of the Pear Tree, Mrs. Vimelo, admitted later that she had been intimidated and threatened, and that she believed John Williams was innocent, calling all evidence found in the pub, including the mall, into question. John Williams' body was exhumed 100 years later when work was carried out to install water mains. His skull was displayed behind the bar in the Crown and Dolphin pub located at the crossroads. The Ratcliff Highway Murders would go on to form the basis for the storyline of 2 episodes of the BBC drama Whitechapel. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and let me know what you think of this case in the comments below, and I look forward to welcoming you in the next one.